I was standing in my garage with my hands covered in wet clay when the doorbell rang 3 times in rapid succession, the kind of aggressive ringing that immediately sets your teeth on edge. My pottery wheel was still spinning, and I had just gotten the walls of a vase to the perfect thickness after 2 failed attempts. The doorbell rang again, 4 times now, each ding-dong more insistent than the last. Coming. I shouted, though I knew whoever was out there probably couldn't hear me over the hum of my kiln cooling down from last night's firing. I grabbed a towel, wiped off the worst of the clay, and headed to the front door. Through the frosted glass panel, I could see a woman's silhouette, hands on hips in that universal stance of someone who was about to make your day significantly worse. I opened the door to find Sharon Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, standing on my welcome mat with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. She was maybe 55, with that specific haircut that seemed to be required for HOA board members, a highlighted blonde bob that somehow looked both overdone and underdone at the same time. Behind her stood 2 other women I vaguely recognized from neighborhood gatherings, both nodding along to whatever Sharon was about to say before she even opened her mouth. "Mr. Randolph," Sharon said, her voice dripping with the kind of false politeness that made you want to slam the door immediately. "We need to discuss a serious violation that's been brought to the board's attention." I glanced down at my clay-covered shirt and jeans. "Can this wait?" "I'm in the middle of something." "No, it cannot wait," Sharon said, her voice going up half an octave. "We've received multiple complaints about industrial equipment being operated in your garage. Specifically, a kiln that's creating excessive heat, noise, and potentially hazardous conditions for your neighbors." I blinked at her. "My pottery kiln, that's what this is about." "This is a residential neighborhood, Mr. Randolph," one of the other women chimed in. Her name tag reads Susan in neat letters. "Not a manufacturing zone. You can't just run a factory out of your garage." "It's a pottery kiln," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice level. "I make bowls and vases. It's a hobby." Sharon's lips pressed into a thin line. "A hobby that violates Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our HOA covenant. No commercial or industrial activities are permitted on residential properties. We're going to need you to remove that equipment immediately, or we'll be forced to take further action." I could feel my blood pressure rising. I'd lived in this house for 3 years, ever since my divorce from Linda had been finalized and I needed a fresh start. I'd bought the place specifically because it had a 2-car garage that was perfect for setting up a pottery studio. I'd checked the HOA rules before I moved in, and there was nothing about home crafts or studios. I'd even asked the previous owner if there would be any issues. "I'm not running a business," I said firmly. "I make pottery for myself. Sometimes I give pieces to friends or donate them to charity auctions. That's not commercial activity." "We have evidence that you've been selling your work online," Sharon said, pulling a printed page from her clipboard. It was a screenshot of my Etsy shop, which I'd set up 6 months ago when a friend convinced me to try selling a few pieces. I'd made maybe $300 total, barely enough to cover the cost of clay and glazes. "That's barely breaking even," I protested. "And it doesn't change the fact that this is my home and my hobby. There's no law against making things in your own garage." "There's an HOA covenant," Sharon shot back, "which you agreed to when you purchased this property. Section 12 is very clear about commercial activities. You have 2 weeks to remove the kiln and cease all manufacturing operations, or we'll begin the fining process. $50 per day until compliance is achieved." $50 a day. My voice came out louder than I intended. "That's insane." "Those are the terms," Sharon said, her smile growing tighter. And if you continue to refuse compliance after 60 days of accumulated fines, we have the authority to place a lien on your property and potentially pursue foreclosure proceedings. The word foreclosure hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd already lost half my savings in the divorce, and I'd poured everything I had left into this house. The pottery had been my therapy, my way of coping with the loneliness and stress of starting over at 42. Now this woman was standing on my doorstep threatening to take it all away because I wanted to make clay pots in my own garage. "This is ridiculous," I said. "You can't just threaten to take someone's house because they have a hobby." "We'll see what the board decides at next week's hearing," Sharon said. "You'll receive formal notification in the mail. Have a good day, Mr. Randolph." She turned on her heel and marched back down my walkway, her two companions trailing behind her like ducklings. I stood there for a long moment, watching them climb into Sharon's white Mercedes SUV and drive away. My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. I went back inside, closed the door, and leaned against it, trying to process what had just happened. Through the doorway to the garage, I could see my pottery wheel still sitting there with the half-finished vase, the clay already starting to dry and crack in the open air. I pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew who might have advice. My brother Marcus had gone through his own HOA nightmare 2 years ago when they tried to fine him for painting his front door the wrong shade of white. He answered on the third ring. "Jake, what's up?" "I need your lawyer's number," I said. "The HOA is trying to make me get rid of my pottery studio." There was a pause. "Seriously? What's their problem?" I explained the situation while I walked back to the garage and carefully removed the ruined vase from the wheel, tossing it into my reclaim bucket. Marcus listened without interrupting, which meant he knew this was serious. "Okay," he said when I finished. "First, don't panic. Second, document everything. Take photos of your setup, keep all your receipts, save every email and letter they send you. Third, call my lawyer, David Chen. He specializes in property law and he knows how to deal with overreaching HOAs. I'll text you his number." "Thanks," I said, feeling slightly less like I was drowning. "I just don't understand why they care. It's not like I'm doing anything that affects anyone else." "Because people like Sharon Whitmore have nothing better to do than police their neighbors," Marcus said. "Trust me, this is about power, not about your kiln. She probably got elected to the board because she likes telling people what to do and you're her latest project. Don't let her win." After we hung up, I spent the next hour photographing everything in my garage studio. My kiln was a mid-sized electric model, the kind thousands of hobbyists used in their homes. It was properly wired, installed by a licensed electrician with all the right permits, and it vented safely through a dedicated exhaust system. I had my pottery wheel, several shelving units with works in progress, bins of clay, and my glazing station. Everything was organized, clean, and safe. I also printed out my Etsy sales records. In 6 months, I'd sold exactly 17 pieces, bringing in a grand total of $342. After Etsy fees, shipping costs, and materials, I'd actually lost money. This was the furthest thing from a commercial operation you could get. The next day, I called David Chen. His receptionist put me through right away after I mentioned Marcus's name. "Jake Randolph." David's voice was crisp and professional. "Marcus told me you might be calling." "Tell me what's going on." I went through the whole story again, this time focusing on the specific threats Sharon had made. David listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions about my sales, the kiln specifications, and the exact wording of the HOA covenant. "Okay," David said when I finished. "Here's what we're dealing with. The HOA is stretching the definition of commercial activity to an absurd degree. Making some pottery and occasionally selling a piece online doesn't constitute a business in any legal sense. However, they do have the covenant language on their side, as vague as it is. The question is whether their interpretation is reasonable and whether they're applying it consistently. "What do you mean, consistently?" I asked. "Does anyone else in your neighborhood work from home? Do any of your neighbors sell anything online, even as a hobby? If the HOA is singling you out while ignoring similar activities by other residents, that's selective enforcement, and it's a strong defense." I thought about it. My neighbor 3 doors down, Patricia, ran an online boutique selling vintage clothes out of her spare bedroom. 2 streets over, someone had a home office for their consulting business with clients visiting regularly. There was even a guy who restored vintage motorcycles in his garage and sold them on Craigslist. "Yeah," I said slowly, "there are definitely other people doing business-related stuff from home." "Perfect. I need you to document that. Drive around, take notes, screenshots of any online businesses you can find with your neighbors' addresses. We need to show that the HOA's enforcement is arbitrary and discriminatory. In the meantime, I'll draft a response to their notice and request a delay of any hearing until we can properly prepare your case." "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Let's start with a flat fee for the initial response and hearing prep, $1,500. If this goes beyond the HOA hearing, we'll discuss next steps. But honestly, once they see you have legal representation and a solid case, they usually back down. They don't want the liability of a discrimination lawsuit." $1,500. I thought about my savings account, already depleted from the divorce. But what choice did I have? I agreed to David's terms and spent the rest of the week gathering evidence. I drove through Meadowbrook Hills with a notebook, documenting every home business I could find. Patricia's vintage boutique was easy to prove since she had a business license registered to her home address. The consultant had a professional shingle hanging by his front door. The motorcycle guy had 3 bikes in various states of repair visible through his open garage door, and his Craigslist ads clearly showed his location. I also took detailed photos and videos of my kiln operation. I measured the noise level with an app on my phone. It was barely louder than a refrigerator running. I measured the temperature at my property line and found no detectable heat increase. I documented my electrical setup, my permits, and my safety certifications from when I'd taken pottery classes at the community college in Boulder, Colorado, before I moved to my current home in Evergreen, Colorado. The formal hearing notice arrived in the mail 5 days after Sharon's visit. It was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center. I was instructed to bring any evidence or documentation I wanted the board to consider. The letter was signed by Sharon Whitmore, president, in a looping script that somehow looked aggressive. David reviewed everything I'd gathered and nodded approvingly. "This is good, really good. We have a strong case for selective enforcement, and your operation is clearly within the bounds of a personal hobby. I'll be there with you at the hearing." The day of the hearing arrived cold and gray, typical March weather for the Colorado mountains. I put on khakis and a button-down shirt, trying to look respectable and non-threatening. David met me in the parking lot of the community center, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive and important. "Remember," he said as we walked in, "stay calm, be respectful, and let me do most of the talking. Don't let them provoke you into saying something emotional." The community center's main room had been set up with a long table at the front where the HOA board sat, Sharon Whitmore in the center like a judge. To her right was Susan, whose last name I'd learned was Mackenzie, and to her left was a thin man named Robert Cross who always looked vaguely apologetic about everything. Behind them, about 20 neighbors had shown up to watch the proceedings, including Patricia and a few others I recognized. Sharon called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel that seemed unnecessarily dramatic. She went through some preliminary business, approval of last month's minutes, a report on the neighborhood landscaping budget, before finally getting to the main event. We're here tonight to address a violation by Mr. Jake Randolph of 4782 Aspen Ridge Drive, Sharon announced, her voice carrying across the room. Mr. Randolph has been operating industrial equipment in his residential garage, specifically a pottery kiln used for commercial manufacturing purposes, in direct violation of our HOA Covenant Section 12, Paragraph 4. Mr. Randolph, would you like to address the board? David stood smoothly. David Chen, representing Mr. Randolph. Before we proceed, I'd like to enter into the record several documents that are relevant to this case. He pulled out a folder and began laying pages on the table in front of the board. First, we have Mr. Randolph's sales records showing minimal revenue that clearly doesn't constitute a business. Second, we have technical specifications and safety documentation for his pottery equipment. Third, and most importantly, we have evidence of multiple other residents in this community who operate home-based businesses or sell items online from their properties, none of whom have been cited for violations. Sharon's face went red. That's not relevant to this case. It's absolutely relevant, David said calmly. Selective enforcement of HOA rules is discriminatory and legally actionable. You can't enforce a rule against one resident while ignoring identical or worse violations by others. That's the definition of arbitrary and capricious enforcement. We're not ignoring anything, Susan spoke up. We simply haven't received complaints about other residents. So enforcement is complaint-driven, David pounced on that. Then the issue isn't the violation itself, but rather that someone complained. That's even more problematic from a legal standpoint. HOA rules should be enforced consistently based on actual violations, not on whether someone's neighbor happens to be vindictive. I saw several people in the audience shift uncomfortably. Sharon's face was now approaching purple. Mr. Randolph's kiln creates noise and heat that affects his neighbors, Sharon said, her voice tight. That's a legitimate safety concern. We have measurements, David said, pulling out more documents. The noise level is 62 decibels at the property line, which is quieter than normal conversation. There's no detectable heat outside the garage. The kiln is electric, properly permitted, and installed to code. There's zero safety risk. We still maintain that this is a commercial operation, Sharon insisted. He has an online store. He sells his products. He's sold 17 items in 6 months for a total of $342, David said. That's less than minimum wage if you calculate his time investment. The IRS wouldn't even classify this as a business because it doesn't show profit motive. It's a hobby that occasionally recoups some costs. Robert Cross cleared his throat. Sharon, I think we should consider what Mr. Chen is saying. If Jake's operation is this minimal, maybe we're overreacting. We are not overreacting, Sharon snapped. Rules are rules. If we let one person violate the covenants, then everyone will think they can do whatever they want. But we already do let other people operate businesses from their homes, a voice called from the audience. It was Patricia, standing up. I run my vintage boutique from my house. I have way more inventory and sales than Jake does with his pottery. Why isn't anyone coming after me? Several other people murmured in agreement. The man who restored motorcycles stood up, I sell bikes from my garage. That's actual commercial activity, but nobody's threatened to foreclose on my house. Sharon banged her gavel. This meeting is about Mr. Randolph's violation, not about other residents. Please sit down. No, Patricia said, staying on her feet. This is about fairness. You're targeting Jake because someone complained, probably Margaret Nelson next door who complains about everything. But Jake's been a perfect neighbor. His pottery is beautiful and he's not hurting anyone. I turned in my seat and saw Margaret Nelson sitting in the back row, her arms crossed and her face set in a scowl. So that was who had filed the complaint. Margaret had hated me since I'd refused to trim my pine tree because she thought it blocked her view of the mountains. Never mind that the tree had been there for 50 years. David seized the moment. The question before this board is simple. Is Mr. Randolph's pottery hobby a violation of HOA covenants, and if so, are you prepared to enforce that interpretation consistently across all residents? Because if you rule against Mr. Randolph, he has grounds for a discrimination lawsuit, and I guarantee you that will cost this HOA far more in legal fees than any potential fines you might collect. The room went silent. Sharon looked at Susan, who looked at Robert, who looked down at the table. The calculation was happening in real time. Was their desire to punish me worth the risk of a lawsuit that would drain HOA funds and potentially expose them to personal liability? We'll need to take this under advisement, Robert said finally. I move that we table this issue pending further review of our enforcement policies. Seconded, Susan said quickly, clearly seeing an exit from this mess. Sharon looked like she wanted to argue, but even she could see the writing on the wall. Fine, she bit out. Motion carries. We'll revisit this issue at next month's meeting after conducting a comprehensive review of home-based activities in the community. David smiled slightly. While you're conducting that review, I assume Mr. Randolph can continue his current activities without threat of fines or other penalties. For now, Sharon said coldly, this meeting is adjourned. People filed out of the community center, several stopping to shake my hand or pat me on the shoulder. Patricia gave me a quick hug. That was intense, she said, but you did great. Sharon's had it coming for a while. She tried to fine the Hendersons last year for having their grandkids' plastic playhouse in the backyard. I thanked everyone who'd spoken up, and then walked with David back to the parking lot. The night air was cold and clean, and I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in a week. What happens now? I asked. Now we wait, David said. They'll probably drag their feet for a month and then quietly drop the issue, hoping you forget about it. Or Sharon will double down and try to enforce rules against everyone, which will cause a revolt and likely get her voted off the board. Either way, you should be fine. Just keep documenting everything and let me know immediately if you receive any more notices or threats. I drove home feeling cautiously optimistic, but that optimism lasted exactly 3 days when I found an envelope in my mailbox with the HOA return address. Inside was a new notice, this time claiming that my pottery kiln required special certification from the International Artisan Guild before it could be operated in a residential zone. The letter stated that without this certification, my operation was unlicensed and subject to immediate shutdown. I stared at the letter in disbelief. The International Artisan Guild. I'd never heard of them. This had to be Sharon making up new requirements just to harass me. I called David immediately. They're grasping at straws, David said after I read him the letter. Let me look into this Artisan Guild. It might be a real organization, but I doubt they have any jurisdiction over your home pottery studio. While David researched, I did my own internet search. The International Artisan Guild turned out to be a legitimate organization, a trade group for craft professionals that offered certifications and licensing for various types of artisan work. They had categories for pottery, jewelry making, woodworking, textile arts, and dozens of other crafts. The certification process involved submitting documentation of your workspace, safety protocols, and skill level, along with a fee and inspection by a guild representative. The more I read, the more intrigued I became. The guild certification was actually respected in the craft community. Having that credential could help if I ever wanted to teach classes or sell my work in galleries. It wasn't just a defensive move against Sharon, it could actually benefit my pottery practice. I called the guild's main office in Seattle and explained my situation to a friendly woman named Carol who worked in their membership department. "We get calls like this sometimes," Carol said. "HOAs or zoning boards asking for proof that someone's craft operation is legitimate and safe. Our certification program is perfect for that. It shows you're not just some amateur messing around, you're operating at a professional standard with proper safety measures." "What does the process involve?" I asked. "First, you submit an application with photos of your workspace and equipment. We review it to make sure everything meets our safety guidelines. Then we schedule an inspection with one of our certified assessors in your area. If everything checks out, you get certified as a licensed craft operation. The whole process usually takes about 3 weeks, and the fee is $200. That's it. It seemed almost too easy. That's it. We're not trying to make this difficult. We want to support artisans and help them navigate situations exactly like yours. Want me to email you the application?" I agreed, and within an hour I had the paperwork. I spent that evening filling it out, taking fresh photos of my garage studio from every angle, and writing detailed descriptions of my safety protocols. I documented my kiln specifications, my ventilation system, my fire extinguisher placement, and my clay and glaze handling procedures. I even included my completion certificates from the pottery classes I'd taken in Boulder. I submitted the application the next morning with the $200 fee. 3 days later, I got a call from a man named Thomas Green, who identified himself as the guild assessor for Colorado and Wyoming. "Got your application, Jake," Thomas said. His voice was warm and enthusiastic. "Looks really solid. I have to say, your setup is actually better than a lot of commercial studios I've seen. You've clearly done your homework on safety and proper practice." "Thanks," I said, feeling oddly proud. "I tried to do everything right from the beginning. It shows." "I can come by next Tuesday if that works for you. The inspection usually takes about an hour. I'll look at your equipment, watch you run a firing cycle or throw a piece, just to verify you know what you're doing, and then assuming everything's good, I can certify you on the spot." We scheduled the inspection for Tuesday afternoon. I spent the weekend cleaning and organizing my studio even more meticulously than usual, making sure every tool was in its place and every surface was spotless. I also threw several new pieces so I'd have leather hard work ready to demonstrate my technique. David called Monday evening to check in. "I looked into the Artisan Guild requirement," he said. "It's completely made up. There's no law or regulation requiring guild certification for home crafts." Sharon just pulled that out of thin air, probably hoping you'd give up rather than jump through more hoops. "I know," I said, "but I'm getting certified anyway. Not because Sharon says I have to, but because it's actually a good credential to have. And when I show up with official certification from a respected organization, it's going to shut down her arguments completely." David laughed. "I like the way you think. Let me know how the inspection goes." Thomas Green arrived Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon, driving a battered Subaru wagon with a "Support Local Artists" bumper sticker. He was maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and permanent clay stains under his fingernails. The kind of person who'd clearly been making pottery for decades. "Jake," he stuck out his hand with a grin. "Thomas Green, great to meet you. Let's see this studio." I showed him into the garage, suddenly nervous despite all my preparation. Thomas walked slowly around the space, examining everything with the eye of someone who knew exactly what to look for. He checked my kiln's wiring and ventilation, nodded approvingly at my fire extinguisher and first aid kit, and spent several minutes reading the labels on my glaze chemicals. "You're using food-safe glazes," he noted. "That's good. A lot of hobbyists don't pay attention to that." "I mostly make bowls and mugs," I said. "I figure if someone's going to eat or drink out of something I made, it should be safe." Thomas smiled. "That's the right attitude." "Okay, how about you throw something for me? I want to see your technique." I sat down at my wheel with a ball of stoneware clay, centering it with practiced movements before pulling up the walls of a bowl. My hands were steadier than I expected. There was something calming about working with clay, even under observation. The piece came up smooth and even, the walls thin but strong, the rim level. "Nice," Thomas said. "Good centering, consistent walls, clean lines. You've had proper training." "Community college classes in Boulder," I said. "And a lot of practice." "It shows. Now fire up your kiln for me. I want to see the loading process and check the temperature controls." I loaded a bisque, firing with some pieces I'd been planning to fire anyway, demonstrating how I used kiln furniture to maximize space while ensuring proper heat circulation. Thomas watched carefully, occasionally asking questions about my firing schedule and cooling process. "Everything looks excellent," Thomas said when I finished. "Your studio meets or exceeds all our safety standards. Your technique is solid, and your workspace organization is professional grade. I'm happy to certify you as a licensed craft operation through the International Artisan Guild." Relief flooded through me. "Really? That's it? That's it? You're clearly serious about your craft and you've put thought into doing things right. That's what we're looking for." He pulled out a tablet and typed for a few minutes. "I'm entering my inspection report now. You'll get your official certificate in the mail within a week, and your license number is active immediately. You can give that to your HOA or anyone else who questions your operation." He handed me a printed form with a license number and his signature. "This is your temporary certificate until the official one arrives. Congratulations, Jake. You're now a licensed artisan." After Thomas left, I sat in my studio holding the certificate and feeling like I'd won something important. This wasn't just about Sharon anymore. This was proof that what I was doing mattered, that I wasn't just messing around in my garage but creating something real and valuable. I called David and told him the news. "Perfect," he said. "Now we have everything we need. The Guild certification proves your operation is legitimate, safe, and professionally recognized. When the HOA tries to claim you're running some kind of dangerous or illegal setup, we have third-party validation that you're not. This is exactly the kind of documentation that shuts down their arguments." Should I wait for them to contact me, or should I send them the certification proactively? I asked. "Let's be proactive. I'll draft a letter explaining that you've obtained certification from the International Artisan Guild as a licensed craft operation, which confirms your pottery studio meets all safety and professional standards. We'll note that this certification is recognized nationally, and that your operation is therefore clearly within the bounds of legitimate home-based craft activities. I'll send it certified mail so we have proof they received it." David's letter went out Thursday, and I received my official certification from the Guild on Saturday. It was printed on heavy paper with an embossed seal and looked impressively official. I framed it and hung it on the wall of my studio, right where anyone entering could see it. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing from Sharon or the HOA. I kept working on my pottery, finishing several pieces. I was particularly proud of including a large serving platter with a blue-green glaze that came out of the kiln looking like ocean water. I listed a few items on my Etsy shop, and to my surprise, they sold within days. Maybe the stress of fighting the HOA was actually improving my work, giving it an emotional depth it hadn't had before. Then, on a Wednesday evening, Sharon showed up at my door again. This time she was alone, no backup committee members, and she looked less confident than during her first visit. "Mr. Randolph," she said stiffly, "I received your letter about the Guild certification." "Good," I said, leaning against the door frame. "So you understand my pottery studio is a licensed, certified operation that meets professional safety standards. The board has concerns about the validity of this certification," Sharon said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We're not sure this Artisan Guild is a legitimate organization." "It's extremely legitimate," I said. "It's been around for 40 years and has members throughout North America. My certification was issued after a thorough inspection by a guild assessor with decades of experience. If you have any questions about the guild's credibility, I'm happy to provide you with their contact information so you can verify it yourself." Sharon's jaw tightened. "This doesn't change the fact that you're running a business from your home. The Etsy sales prove commercial intent. According to the IRS, an activity becomes a business when it shows consistent profit over multiple years," I said, repeating what David had coached me to say. "My pottery is still operating at a net loss when you factor in all costs. That's hobby classification, not business. And even if it were a business, the Guild certification proves it's a legitimate craft operation that's safe for residential areas. Unless you're prepared to ban all home-based work in this community, which would affect dozens of residents, you don't have grounds to single me out." "We'll see about that," Sharon said, but she was already backing away. "The board will make a final determination at next month's meeting." I watched her walk back to her car, and I couldn't help feeling like the tide had turned. She was still fighting, but without real ammunition now. The certification had changed the dynamic completely. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for mid-April. David advised me to attend, but said it probably wouldn't be contentious. "They're looking for a way to back down without losing face," he explained. "They'll probably make some statement about having reviewed your operation and determined it's acceptable under revised interpretations of the covenants. Sharon will try to claim victory by saying the certification requirement was necessary, even though she made it up. Let her have that. The important thing is you get to keep your studio." The meeting played out almost exactly as David predicted. Sharon announced that the board had completed its comprehensive review of home-based activities and determined that properly licensed and certified craft operations were acceptable under the HOA covenants. She made a point of saying the certification requirement had been important for ensuring safety and professional standards, as if that had been their concern all along rather than just trying to shut me down. Several board members looked uncomfortable during her speech, clearly aware they were rewriting history. But Robert Cross made a motion to accept the new interpretation. Susan seconded it, and it passed unanimously. Just like that, my pottery studio was officially approved. I should have known it wouldn't end there. 2 weeks after the meeting, I was loading a kiln when I heard a loud crash from outside. I ran out to find Margaret Nelson, my complaining neighbor, standing in my driveway next to my car. She'd thrown a rock through my windshield. You think you've won? Margaret shouted, her face red with rage. You and your stupid pottery. You've ruined this neighborhood. The noise, the smell, the strangers coming to your house to buy your junk. Margaret, what are you talking about? I said, keeping my distance. She looked unhinged. There's no noise or smell, and nobody comes to my house. I ship everything through the mail. Liar. I see them. People parking on the street, walking up to your house at all hours. I realized she was talking about my mail carrier and occasionally a delivery driver dropping off clay supplies. She'd worked herself into some kind of paranoid delusion about my pottery studio being a major commercial operation with constant traffic. Margaret, you need to calm down, and you need to pay for my windshield. I'm not paying for anything. You're the one who should pay for what you've done to our property values. She picked up another rock. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. I need police at 4782 Aspen Ridge Drive in Evergreen. My neighbor just vandalized my car and she's threatening to do it again. That seemed to snap Margaret back to reality. She dropped the rock and hurried back toward her house, but not before I'd gotten several photos of her standing next to my damaged windshield, clearly showing the rock in her hand. The Jefferson County Sheriff's deputy who responded was professional and thorough. He took my statement, photographed the damage, and went to speak with Margaret. He came back 20 minutes later with his report. Mrs. Nelson admitted to throwing the rock, he said. She claims you've been harassing her by running noisy equipment late at night, though she couldn't provide any specific dates or evidence. I'm citing her for criminal mischief and property damage. You'll need to file a claim with your insurance for the windshield, but I'd recommend also getting a restraining order if she continues to bother you. Will she be arrested? I asked. She'll get a court summons. Given that this is a first offense and relatively minor property damage, she'll probably get probation and have to pay restitution. But it'll be on her record, and if she does anything else, the consequences will be more severe. After the deputy left, I sat on my front steps and tried to process what had just happened. Margaret's rage had been so disproportionate to reality. Sure, I ran a pottery kiln a few times a week, but it was quiet, clean, and completely contained to my property. The idea that this justified smashing my windshield was insane. I called David and explained the situation. This is good for your case, actually, he said, which wasn't what I expected to hear. It demonstrates that the complaints against you were motivated by personal animosity, rather than legitimate concerns. If the HOA tries to come after you again, we can point to Margaret's criminal behavior as evidence that this was never about actual violations. The next day, I got a call from Patricia, my neighbor with the vintage boutique. Jake, I heard about what Margaret did. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said. Pissed off about my windshield, but fine. Good. Listen, I'm organizing a petition to recall Sharon from the HOA board. After what happened at that hearing, and now with Margaret going crazy, a bunch of us think the board needs new leadership. Would you be willing to sign? Absolutely, I said. What are the chances of actually getting her removed? Pretty good, actually. You need signatures from 20% of homeowners to force a recall vote, and I already have 15%. People are tired of Sharon's power trips. She tried to fine the Johnsons for having a vegetable garden in their front yard last month. Said it violated the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. I shook my head. A vegetable garden, that's insane. Right, so we're done with her. The recall vote should happen next month. Over the following weeks, I watched the neighborhood drama unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. Patricia's petition succeeded in forcing a recall election, and Sharon fought it viciously. sending emails to every homeowner claiming the recall was being organized by troublemakers who wanted to destroy property values. She specifically mentioned me and my pottery studio as examples of the kind of violations the neighborhood would face without strong board leadership. It backfired spectacularly. Her emails just reminded everyone of how unreasonably she'd targeted me, and more people signed the recall petition. By the time the special election was scheduled, it was clear Sharon was going to lose. 2 days before the vote, I got another visitor. This time it was Susan McKenzie, the board member who'd backed Sharon during the initial hearing. "Jake, can I talk to you for a minute?" Susan looked nervous and apologetic. "Sure," I said, gesturing for her to come in. We sat in my living room and Susan twisted her hands in her lap. "I want to apologize," she said finally, "for how the board handled your pottery situation. Sharon convinced us that you were running some kind of major commercial operation and that we needed to crack down before it got out of control. But after I actually looked into it, after I talked to other neighbors and saw how minimal your sales really were, I realized we were completely wrong. You weren't doing anything wrong and we treated you terribly." I appreciated the apology, even if it was coming only after Sharon's political position had collapsed. "Thank you," I said. "It's been a stressful few months. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm planning to vote for Sharon's recall, for what it's worth. She's been getting more and more controlling, and the pottery thing was just the most obvious example. We need board members who are reasonable and willing to listen, not wannabe dictators." Susan left, and I felt a small sense of vindication. It wasn't just me who'd seen Sharon's behavior as unreasonable. The whole neighborhood had finally had enough. The recall election happened on a Tuesday evening in early May. I attended the meeting, mostly out of curiosity. The vote wasn't even close. Sharon was removed from the board with 78% voting in favor of recall. She left the community center in tears, not speaking to anyone. Robert Cross, who'd always seemed uncomfortable with Sharon's aggressive approach, was elected as the new board president. One of his first acts was to formally apologize to me on behalf of the HOA for the harassment I'd endured over my pottery studio. "The board wants you to know that your craft operation is welcome in this community," Robert said, shaking my hand after the meeting. "We're actually thinking about organizing a neighborhood art fair next summer. Would you be interested in participating?" "Maybe," I said, surprised by the offer. "Let me think about it." As for Margaret Nelson, her criminal mischief case went to court in June. I had to testify about the windshield incident and the history of her complaints about my pottery. The judge was not sympathetic to her defense that she'd been driven to desperation by my industrial operation. She was sentenced to 1-year probation, ordered to pay restitution for my windshield, and required to attend anger management classes. She was also issued a restraining order keeping her at least 100 feet away from me and my property. I saw her occasionally after that, getting her mail or working in her yard, but she never looked at me or spoke to me. The anger seemed to have burned out, replaced by embarrassment. Her house went up for sale in August. I heard through the neighborhood gossip that she was moving to a condo in Denver where she wouldn't have to deal with neighbors. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. I kept making pottery, improving my technique and experimenting with new glaze combinations. My Etsy sales increased gradually, though never to the point where it was actually profitable as a business. I didn't care about the money anymore. The pottery itself was enough. The guild certification turned out to be valuable in unexpected ways. A local community college in Golden reached out asking if I'd be interested in teaching a beginner pottery class. The fact that I was a licensed artisan gave me credibility, and the teaching opportunity sounded fun. I started instructing 8 students one evening a week, sharing the techniques and joy of working with clay that had become such an important part of my life. David Chen called occasionally to check in and see if I was having any more HOA troubles. I never did. The new board under Robert Cross was reasonable and focused on actual community issues like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events, not policing what people did in their own garages. One Saturday morning in September, I was working in my studio when I heard a knock on the garage door. I looked up to find a teenage kid standing there, maybe 16 years old, looking nervous. "Are you Jake Randolph?" he asked. "That's me. Can I help you?" "I heard you teach pottery." "I'm interested in learning. I saw the article in the Evergreen newspaper about you and your studio." I had forgotten about that article. A local reporter had written a piece about the HOA controversy and how it had ended with me getting certified by the Artisan Guild. The reporter had framed it as a feel-good story about standing up for your passions against unreasonable bureaucracy. "I do teach a class at the community college," I said. "But that's for adults. How old are you?" 16. "The college class won't let me enroll, but I really want to learn pottery." "I'm willing to pay for private lessons if you're interested." I looked at the kid, seeing something of myself in his eagerness. "What's your name?" Derek Morrison. "I live over on Pine Creek Road." "Tell you what, Derek. Let me talk to your parents and make sure they're okay with you coming over here. If they are, I'll teach you the basics for free. Consider it community service." Derek's face lit up. "Really? That would be amazing." His parents were fine with it, happy that their son was interested in something creative instead of just playing video games. Derek started coming over twice a week after school, and I discovered I actually enjoyed the one-on-one teaching even more than the group class. Derek had natural talent and genuine passion for the craft. Within 2 months, he was throwing bowls that were better than my early attempts. One afternoon, while Derek was working at the wheel, Sharon Whitmore's old allies drove past and slowed down, clearly curious about what was happening in my garage. I waved cheerfully and they sped up and drove away. I couldn't help but laugh. This was exactly what Sharon had been afraid of, my pottery studio becoming more visible and active in the neighborhood. But instead of being a problem, it was adding value, giving a kid a creative outlet and a skill he could carry for life. That Christmas, I made pottery gifts for all my neighbors, even the ones who'd supported Sharon during the controversy. Handmade mugs with personalized glazes, small bowls perfect for holding keys or change, decorative pieces that caught the light. I left them on doorsteps with notes saying they were thank you gifts for being part of a great community. I got more thank you messages back than I expected. People appreciated the handmade quality and the personal touch. Several neighbors started stopping by to chat when they saw my garage door open, asking about my pottery or just making small talk. The studio that had almost gotten me thrown out of my house had become a neighborhood gathering spot. Patricia suggested I submit some work to a gallery in Denver that specialized in local artisans. "You're actually really good," she said, examining a vase I'd just finished. "This isn't hobby-level work anymore. You should try to get into some serious shows." I submitted photos to the gallery, not expecting much. To my surprise, they accepted 3 of my pieces for their spring exhibition. The opening was in March, almost exactly 1 year after Sharon had first shown up at my door threatening eviction. The gallery opening was more nerve-wracking than any HOA hearing. My work was displayed alongside professional artists who'd been working for decades, but people responded to it, complimenting the clean lines and the depth of my glazes. I sold 1 piece that night, a large bowl with a copper-green glaze that had turned out better than I'd hoped. The buyer paid $400, which was more than I'd ever gotten for a single piece. Marcus came to the opening and pulled me aside at one point. "You know, this whole HOA nightmare was probably the best thing that could have happened to you," he said. "How do you figure that?" I asked. "Because it forced you to take your pottery seriously. You got the guild certification, you started teaching, you're exhibiting in galleries now. If Sharon hadn't thrown her fit, you might have just kept making pots in your garage and never pushed yourself to this level." I thought about that. Marcus might be right. The stress and anger from the HOA fight had pushed me to prove that my pottery mattered, that it was legitimate and valuable. That drive had made me a better artist and opened doors I never would have found otherwise. "Still," I said, "I could have done without the death threats to my kiln." Marcus laughed. "Fair point. By summer, I was teaching 3 classes and had work in 2 galleries. My Etsy shop was actually starting to make a small profit, though nothing that would replace my day job in IT support. But that was fine. The pottery had never been about making money. It was about creating something beautiful with my own hands, about the meditative calm of working with clay, about the surprise and delight when a piece came out of the kiln transformed by fire and glaze into something more than I'd imagined." Derek was now good enough that he was helping me teach beginner students. He'd also been accepted to a college art program with a strong ceramics department, something he credited to the portfolio we'd built together. Watching him succeed felt almost as good as my own achievements. The neighborhood art fair that Robert Cross had proposed actually happened in August. 15 local artists set up booths in the community center parking lot, displaying paintings, photographs, jewelry, woodwork, and my pottery. Hundreds of neighbors came through, buying art and supporting local creators. Sharon's house had sold by then, so she wasn't there to see how her attempt to shut down my pottery had inadvertently sparked a celebration of art in Meadowbrook Hills. I sold out of my inventory at the art fair and took commissions for custom pieces. People wanted mugs with their initials, bowls in specific colors to match their kitchens, decorative platters for special occasions. The work kept me busy in my studio every evening and most weekends, but it was the best kind of busy. One October evening, I was just finishing up a firing when David Chen called. We hadn't spoken in months, since there'd been no more legal issues to handle. "Jake, I wanted to give you an update on something," David said. "Remember how I mentioned that selective enforcement and discrimination cases can sometimes lead to broader consequences?" "Yeah," I said, not sure where this was going. "Well, after your case, I got contacted by 3 other residents in HOA communities around Colorado who were facing similar situations. Home businesses being targeted while others were ignored, arbitrary rule enforcement, that kind of thing. I represented all 3, and in each case, we were able to use the precedent from your situation to shut down the HOA's harassment. One case even resulted in a discrimination settlement that cost the HOA $20,000. Seriously, I was stunned. Seriously. Your fight against Sharon Whitmore didn't just save your pottery studio. It created case law that's protecting other people from similar abuse. I wanted you to know that, because what you went through matters beyond just your personal situation. You stood up to an overreaching HOA and won, and now other people are winning because you did. After David hung up, I sat in my studio surrounded by shelves of pottery in various stages of completion, and thought about the strange journey the last year and a half had been. It had started with anger and fear, with Sharon Whitmore threatening to take away my home because I wanted to make bowls and vases in my garage. It had been stressful and expensive, and at times felt completely overwhelming. But it had also been transformative. I discovered that my pottery mattered to people, that it was good enough to sell in galleries and teach to students. I'd found a community of fellow artists and supportive neighbors. I'd learned to stand up for myself against bullying and arbitrary authority. And apparently, I'd helped create legal protection for other people facing similar situations. Sharon had tried to shut down my pottery studio because she saw it as a violation of her vision for the neighborhood, something messy and creative that didn't fit her need for control. Instead, she'd inadvertently launched me into a more serious artistic practice and sparked a neighborhood transformation toward supporting creativity and individual expression. I pulled out a fresh ball of clay and centered it on the wheel. My hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, the clay rising and shaping under my fingers. This piece would be a large serving bowl, I decided. Something generous and expansive, with a bright glaze that caught the light. Something that embodied abundance and community. As I worked, I thought about the kiln cooling behind me, full of pieces that would be beautiful when I opened it tomorrow. I thought about Derek, probably working on his college applications right now, describing his passion for ceramics. I thought about the students in my evening class, discovering the joy of making something with their own hands. I thought about the people in Denver who owned my pottery, using it daily in their homes. Sharon had wanted to evict me from my pottery kiln. Instead, that kiln had become the heart of something much larger than myself, a source of art and teaching and community connection. The International Artisan Guild certification she demanded as a desperate last attempt to shut me down had become a credential that opened doors and validated my work. Sometimes the obstacles people put in your way become the very things that push you to grow beyond what you thought possible. Sharon had been an obstacle, but she'd also been inadvertently a catalyst. I'd never thank her for it, but I could acknowledge the strange truth that fighting her had made me a better artist and a more confident person. The bowl I was throwing came up smooth and even, the walls thin enough to let light through when I held it up. It was some of my best work, proof of how far I'd come in the months since this whole mess started. I finished the rim, cut the bowl free from the wheel and set it on the shelf to dry. Tomorrow I'd open the kiln and see what transformations the fire had wrought. Tomorrow I'd teach my evening class and watch my students discover their own creative potential. Tomorrow I'd work on the commission pieces waiting on my to-do list, each one a connection to someone who valued handmade art. But tonight, I just sat in my studio, hands still clay-covered, and felt grateful for this space, this practice, this life I'd built around making beautiful things. Sharon Whitmore had tried to take it away from me, but she'd failed. The pottery kiln she'd wanted to evict me for was still here, still firing, still transforming raw earth into art. And that, more than any legal victory or guild certification, felt like winning.